Hey, I'm Cyclon. Before I'm going to show you the clip for the upcoming video, very important, very quickly. There might be flashing lights, or rather there are flashing lights. If you have issues with flashing lights or if you have issues with bright lights, please do not watch the video. Feel free to listen to it, but I cannot recommend watching it. Vaal Ice Nova, which is the skill that will be used in this video, is very flashy, it's very bright, especially with the Celestial MTX. This is just a warning, feel free to watch it, but do it on your own risk if you have issues with flashing lights or bright lights. Alright, enjoy the clip of the build. So, it turns out I'm addicted to Legion. That's fine, because I love Legion. But to solve this issue with my addiction, I found a solution. I need to find the best Legion build for all budget levels. Now, there can be different ones, but they have to be the best at it. They have to clear the Legion very quickly based on the budget level. They have to be able to have a decent amount of life, and to start with it and to find the best one, I looked at an old 3.7 Legion farmer. 3.7 was the Legion League for those that haven't played it, and that was Vaal Ice Nova. The idea is you stand in the middle, you click your Ice Nova, or well, the Vaal version of it, and the whole Legion explodes. Did I have success? Kind of. Is it interesting and fun to play? Very. But there are some other important questions that I need to be answering before people click off of this video. The Mageblood is not needed for this build. I use the Mageblood so I have an easier time with my rares, but by adjusting the build around a bit you will lose a bit of EHP, but it definitely can be done without Mageblood. I've seen other variants of the build working, just this specific variant is easier with the Mageblood than without. Again, it's not needed, just nice to have. The next thing to ask, is this better than Tornado Shot Deadeye? Probably not. Is it, again, a lot of fun to play? Yes. This is very satisfying to play. You might have seen it in the clip. Vaal Ice Nova just nukes packs, almost nukes Legion. It's a very amazing build. I had a lot of fun with it, albeit I did die quite a bit. So, this build is fairly squishy. I tried to improve the EHP as bad as I could. The max hit is really bad, but the damage sustain, at least while you're leeching or while you're damaging something, is really good though. With that being said, let's finally take a look at the defensive and offensive layers of this build, because there is some complexity in there that I need to explain before we can take a look at the passive tree, the gem setup and everything. Alright. For our defenses, early on with the non-Mageblood version, we will be focusing our defenses on base layer of evasion rating. If we have a Mageblood, we can add determination and armor into the mix, but for non-Mageblood builds I recommend sticking to evasion. We then utilize Petrified Blood to negate incoming damage. Combining that with a Blood Notch Immutable Force combination, which we have here, to further utilize the delay of the damage with Petrified Blood, that we are constantly gaining and losing life, and by setting it up perfectly we are also not we are a little bit above 50% life unreserved, which means that when we are leeching, because we aren't hitting our unreserved max life, we are not losing the leech, so we have on top of our petrified blood, on top of blood notch, we have also over leech basically in the build. Then we have 4 endurance charges that give us physical damage reduction and elemental resistances, combining with an immortal call which actually can consume those endurance charges. Why I know that and how this works I get to in a bit. And finally we have a mind over matter in this build, combining with Eldritch Battery allows us to reserve all our mana and still use the asset we have as a defensive layer, which we have a ton of because we also have Energy Shield Leech on the build. Overall, the sustain is really great, but the max hit does suffer. We will die with this build eventually here and there. It is not a build that I can see myself farming to level 100 by running daily maps or legion maps. I wouldn't even recommend it for daily maps. I specifically made this version to be really great at legion farming, and for that it's definitely amazing, albeit again a bit squishy. For our offensive layers, we have a very interesting setup to do our offensive. I tried to automate as much as possible so it's a good mapper. Despite that, you can see my skill bar is still very full. I have 6 auras I'm using, and then I have an automated curse on hit on a ring. Then I have a mark on hit, Assassin's Mark. Now before anybody says, but mark on hit only works on attacks, I do know. We have shield charge as our mobility skill, which we also can use in place. So if there's anything that is very tanky and we cannot just kill it with our Ice Nova Frostbolt interaction, which I get to in a moment, we can shield charge it once, apply Assassin's Mark, and we are good to go again. So what we do need to do in a map, we need to move around, of course, with a combination of shield charge and holding left click. The moment we see anything that we want to kill, we will stop holding left click, we gain our charges, we keep our Zeal Tree with the Divine Blessing up at all times, as long as possible of course, and then we press Ice Nova. We're going to cast 2 Ice Novas thanks to Spell Echo. The first one will freeze whatever we're hitting, the second one will deal massive amount of damage and usually kill whatever we are hitting. If it doesn't die one time, well, we can hold it down and do it a few times. But, of course, if it's something more tanky, like a map boss, a Legion General, a Delirium boss, we're going to, again, keep our Zeal Tree up. We're going to cast a Frostbolt, and then we hold down Ice Nova, and it's going to melt the boss. Well, freeze the boss, but melting sounds more appropriate in this term. It's absurd single target for a mapping build. Now, let's say you're running into a Legion, because this is a Legion build. We then have a special interaction by activating Zeal Tree, activating our Frost Shield. This will set our ES close to 0 if not 0, but that's okay because our Vaal Ice Nova, which we should have prepared for running a Legion, is actually not consuming any mana. So we activate this interaction and then we cast Vaal Ice Nova. You will be able to see it in the mapping footage and just nuke almost the entire Legion. Sometimes we nuke the full Legion, sometimes we do not. Usually if we don't, there's going to be at the end, at the corner of the Legion, a rare standing, or we found a very tanky rare, or we found a proximity shield or a general. In that case, once we have full cleared the Legion, while the Ice Nova is clearing, while everything is lagging, stand still. If we move while the Ice Nova is damaging, we lose our power charges, so the Ice Nova does less damage, has less AoE. Once the lag has stopped, we move to one end of the Legion, clear whatever's there, move to the other end of the Legion, clear whatever's there, and the Legion should pop completely. Then we flame dash back into the middle and do our Vaal Ice Nova again. Now, on the mapping footage, I was actually using a thing called the Player's Vaal Skills Do Not Apply Soul Gain Prevention Compass. If you do not have this for your mapping experience, outside of Legion clear, this build will feel a bit, I would say, not smooth. You need to dash, Frost Nova, dash, Frost Nova, or Shield Charge, Frost Nova, Shield Charge, Frost Nova, or Flame Blink, Frost Nova. But if you have this sextant, there is no Soul Gain prevention on your Vaal Ice Nova, so whenever you use Vaal Ice Nova to clear a big pack, as it chains further and further, it then instantly gets the souls from those kills, so you move to the next pack and repeat it, making the mapping of this build way smoother. Now we should always have one up for Legion, pre-Legion, and post-Legion stasis, but this is very important for the playstyle of this build. This is why I mentioned this step by step. Now, moving on to how this build works in detail, because there are some interactions that I want to cover, so that when you copy this build and something isn't working, you can look at the step, check if you have covered all the steps, and then, of course, if still something's not working, always feel free to message me, and I will take a look with you to fix your build. So, how are we keeping these charges without a timer? We are utilizing the Relicash Impatience boots. Now, if you want those boots, they don't have to be corrupted. All we care about is that the Chaos Res is a max roll, or as close to a max roll as possible, based on our budget, and then we're going to use those. These boots are going to set our minimum to maximum charges while we're standing still. This is why I have 12 Endurance, Frenzy, and 4 Endurance, 12 Frenzy, and 12 Power charges. Now, because we want as many power charges as possible as we are stacking those, we need to get some sources of power charges. We can get 3 from our tree, 1 from a tattoo, 1 from our Ascendency, 1 from a void battery, and 2 from Malachite's loop. Now, Malachite's loop, because it has a downside. The downside is that if we lose our maximum charge, when we reach our maximum power charges, so usually whenever we stop moving and we get our minimum set to maximum, we get shocked for 2 seconds. We're taking 15% increased damage. We can utilize once either early on with higher void shock or remove shock flask, or later on with a Mageblood increase effectiveness shock flask. We can remove the downside. Alternatively, I've seen many versions of this build running Tempest Shield to negate the shock effectiveness. I personally didn't like that. I ran with the shock on low budget before I adjusted to this. I mean, low budget is in quotations in this case, but this is totally fine as well. You can either get shock avoidance from a Tempest Shield, from a flask, whatever you prefer, or you can just run with it and you will die a bit more again. It's just one of the things that makes this build a bit more awkward to play. But yeah, we get power charges from here. Now, to convert our power charges into frenzy charges, we're going to use a badge of the Brotherhood. So now we have a lot of power charges and a lot of frenzy charges. This also allows us to use the Militant Phase, combining with the converted by High Templar Dominus to give us Inner Conviction. Now, usually Inner Conviction doesn't allow us to gain any frenzy charges. However, if our minimum frenzy charges are set equal to our maximum charges, we aren't gaining them, we just have them suddenly. So we bypass this Inner Conviction downside, so we get the more spell damage from the power charges, but we also keep the more damage from the frenzy charges, meaning this is 48% more damage and also 36% more spell damage, giving us 2 big more multipliers. Finally, we're going to take all this damage scaling from power and frenzy charges and add on top of all that Heat Shiver. So because we are always freezing everything, because of this massive cold damage of our Ice Nova and Vaal Ice Nova, the second hit will then also ignite it. But for our Vaal Ice Nova, we have an added benefit of using Blast Freeze, which makes our freeze spread. So if we freeze something, the Blast Freeze makes the freeze spread, then the Vaal Ice Nova chains, because, it causes smaller novas up to 5 times on enemy hits, so the enemy gets frozen, spreads the freeze around it, then the small Ice Nova hits around it, and the next thing gets a double damage, meaning we have even more damage that gets spread further. Just wonderful. And this is really the big interaction package. We have some more things to note, like using Painted Human combined with Petrified Blood and using any one skill to get actually set to low life, so that we have a massive amount of more damage here. Because we're using the Blood Notch Immutable Force stun combination, using the Energy Mastery, we have some more spell damage when we stun, so another big more multiplier. We utilize Mind Over Matter, Eldritch Battery for survivability. They're just a few interactions here that just add more damage, but the most complicated interaction is the way we gain our power and frenzy charges, which again, for the TLDR, Relicash Impatience, or is it TLDL, too long didn't listen, I don't know. Relicash Impatience scaling power charges over Ascendency in tree, Void Battery, Malachite Loop, setting them at maximum, then setting our Frenzy charges very high with Badge of the Brotherhood, using Inner Conviction to get more spell damage from our power charges, freezing enemies, spreading the freeze, and then utilizing Heat Shiver to double the damage by also applying a huge fire damage to the enemies. Alright, now with that out of the way, let's take a closer look at our Ascendency. I already mentioned that we are using the power charge stacking. Forbidden Power giving us AoE, which is great for Ice Nova, damage, which is great for power charge stacking, and an additional charge is a great Ascendency pickup for us. On top of that, of course, we have Void Beacon giving us negative cold resistance and cold chaos resistance to nearby enemies, which usually we standing a bit further away, but with our Ice Nova, everything around us does take that additional damage. Then we have Frigid Wake for more cold damage, and we have Freeze and Chill Immune, combining that later on with the Flask suffix and the Mageblood, or getting it via other shenanigans. For example, we can drop some damage to gain Cannot Be Shocked while maximum power charges here, which would also work, or we can use Temper Shield. We don't really need the all avoidance anymore, because for Ignite we can just have Soul of Avarice, less duration of Ignite on you, and we are basically not technically Element immune, but almost elemental avoidance, almost Element immune. And then of course we have Unholy Authority. As mentioned, we have Assassin's Mark and Frostbite. This allows us to apply both. I did test out Profane Bloom. It doesn't add anything for us. This is the best Ascendency setup I noticed. This is what I'm going to recommend as well. The rest of our tree, we go to the right Shadow Star to get the power charge, also grabbing up the life here. We go to the Templar Star to also take up the power charge, also picking up the endurance charge and the life over here. On the top side, we're picking up, of course, the power charge as well as the power charge scaling, and the rest of the tree is spell damage and spell crit, more spell crit, more crit, and more crit, of course. We do need both Serenity and Influence to cover all our auras on mana and on life. And then we pick up a Leech Mastery with Instant Leech. You have the choice between Ethereal Feast and Light Eater. However, Ethereal Feast is the better one. It gives more recovery, which is the better option, as this one is really just a little bit more damage while on full energy shield. However, we are sometimes not technically full energy shield, so the little bit extra damage is something that I didn't want to pick up. I rather had a bit more ES Leech, working better with our Eldritch Battery and Might of a Matter, as well as with the Froshier Leech, so we add more ES at all times once we are leeching. Then we also have one cluster we want to pick up. The cluster that we want to pick up is a Blanket of Snow, Blast Freed, Widespread Destruction, giving us AoE, Freeze Spread, and also giving us additional cold penetration, which we can use for more single target damage and getting our Vaal Ice Nova to more consistently kill the big rares or uniques. And then we finally get to our medium clusters, which we want one with Magnifier War's Power, Magnifier giving us crit multi and AoE, perfect for our build, and the other one giving us AoE and area damage. Now we could get 2 waste powers, then capping out at 50 AoE. Right now I'm at 36 AoE instead. The last 14 AoE weren't that important, so I rather went with Precise Retaliation, Magnifier. Now, for those wondering why Precise Retaliation, it's a big crit chance multiplier, allowing me to not go for the crit chance suffix. And the Magnifier, of course, is pretty good. And also, we actually do have a 23 chance to block attack damage, as we are getting hit quite a bit, using Immutable Force and Blood Notch to mitigate that. We sometimes blocking an attack, which means we sometimes get 30% crit multi for free, which is a nice to have. Now, a few things to mention on the jewel spots. Starting here. The Militant Phase, it doesn't matter what seed it is, it doesn't matter what it gives, you have 70 devotion, you barely get anything from it. The mana cost and area damage are nice to have, but by no means needed. What is very, very important here is that you find one that is converted by High Templar Dominus, And also the seed does not apply anything to overcharge, endurance, and devotion. For example, this one applies something to, I think it was Faith and Steel. This one gives me fist converted fire damage, while devotion, I don't have the devotion. Or like here with a Divine Judgment, I can't get the minimum frenzy charge because I don't have the devotion. So anything that this would give us, we can access. So we just hope that we don't get anything on these three. Just take the jewel, add it to a POB, check the spots, check if these three are still unaffected, and if this one is in a conviction, and you're good to go. Also, I tested it. If you apply in a 2 to a stat node, to a travel node, and then the jewel, it overrides it. It doesn't give like it does to other small nodes that give something else a 5 devotion. It still considers like a stat node and gives you flat 10 devotion. So you don't need to apply tattoos here. All things that are worth noting. We of course need one spot for Blood Notch and one spot for Mutable Force. And then we have options. We can take Watcher's Eye with like Hatred Crit Multi, Hatred Pen, Zeal Tree Pen, Zeal Tree Cast Speed, or any Watcher's Eye that is decent. And we can take rares with like double crit multi, triple crit multi, life and crit multi. We should get corrupted blood immunity on any of the jewels, is at least my recommendation. Or we can get Hypnotic Eye jewels with like cold damage to spells while holding a shield, flat life and crit multi. And that's pretty much for the jewels. We have a few spots. Right now I'm using 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I mean, we want to level up 4, 5, 6 slots, and with 2 more levels, afterwards I could get 1 additional, or I can invest it into life. As you can see, my max life is very low, which is not a good thing. But anyway, that's the tree. Long enough talked about that. Let's take a look at our gems, before we finally get to the gear section, and the adjustments that you can do to cover it without Mageblood. The POBR has the tree as well. I didn't forget about it, there is a non-Mageblood version, don't worry. Now, our gems. We are using auras. On our mana, we are reserving, in your case, without a Mageblood, Grace, Hatred, and Petrified Blood. If you have a Mageblood, Determination, Hatred, and Petrified Blood. In our life, we reserve Blood and Sand, which is of the Divergent quality, Precision, and Defiance banner. Now, very important again. Please do note on this, else the build might not work as intended and you will lose your sustain. I'm using a level 21 Arrogance and a level 15 Precision, and I think I still have the... Yes. No, I don't have it anymore. And now in additional life reservation efficiency. These are all max life on the tree, by the way. I experimented a bit with them. You can do it, you don't have to use tattoos, but I just wanted to mention, I forgot to say that, those are doable. So, what you want to do is you want to exactly reserve 49% of your life, or 49.5. As you can see here, if I use a life flask, I'm recovering, I get to 1461. If I use, that was not the skill I wanted to use, if I use any skill, I spend a bit of life and then I go up to 54. So that's 13 unreserved life, that is over half life. Which means that these 13 life cannot be recovered by my leech, cannot be recovered by ES on hit, life on hit, or if anything I would have, which means that this one, as long as I don't use a life flask, will be over leech. Now I do have still a life flask for the case of I'm getting hit by a shit ton of enemies and my delayed damage actually outvalues or outnumbers the overleech value that I have, and I can counter leech it. Then I just press a life flask, and because of the more recovery if used while in low life, I recover so much life that I instantly, or very close to instantly, get to full life again, because all this degen life gets to convert it back to normal life. So this is again very important. Get a slightly less than 50% reservation, so you're between 49 to 49.5 preservation of your life. Then other things that you want is an Immortal Call on left click. Now getting to Immortal Call. Immortal Call consumes our endurance charges even though they're minimum. We know that because if we use this flask, you will see that it gives me onslaught per 3 seconds for each frenzy charge consumed. I have 12 frenzy charges, I use it, I get 36 onslaught. Despite them being minimum charges, they get consumed by Rotgut. So logically they should also be consumed by my Immortal Call. Now it says that it lasts 1.2 seconds, and it also lasts longer for each endurance charge removed. Here, the top line buff duration endurance charge, so it's 80% increased duration. I see there, like, if you take a look, it's very quick, but you see a 2-4 second, so this is why we assume that it's working. So while we have it, we have a lot less EHP, but of course it only lasts like 2 seconds a bit. But whenever we cast this and we are on the move again, especially with sheer charge, we hold down left click and sheer charge, which usually procs both. So while we are a bit more vulnerable because we don't have the charges, we have the Mortal Call triggered. Then we have a Frost Shield, which we use for our legions. We have our Divine Zeal Tree, which we want to keep up at times, preferring Zeal Tree over Hatred as it gives us slightly more damage based on my PoE passive building values. And then we have again the Mark on Hit Assassin's Mark. We don't really care about Assassin's Mark quality unless it is an anomalous Assassin's Mark, which you can pick up if you want to. Mark on Hit, we take the basic quality. Then we have a Flame Dash for getting over ledges or hills. We then have our Aura Hatred, of course, and our Aura Determination. I already mentioned those. Then we have a Shield Shot, fast attacks for our moving around. I did try Lightning Warp, but despite it being a bit safer, it didn't feel as smooth as Sheer Charge, even with Quicksilver or even with just Silver Flask, without Quicksilver, which I used in the Mageblood version. It still felt better than Lightning Warp. Finally, we have our Frostbolt setup, which is combined with Volley and Slow Projectile. We need one additional projectile so that our Ice Nova, which procs off up to 2 Frostbolts, can proc. So the best thing we can get is Volley, as this will confirm the biggest overlap on big bosses, and Slow Projectile, so that if we like throw a few, cast a few on them, we have a very big hit duration on the bosses on our Ice Nova if needed. Now finally getting to the gear. So first covering the Mageblood option as I have it here on me, then going to POB to cover the non-Mageblood option. Our gear will be the following. We are going, of course, Relicash Impatience, Malachite's Loop, which don't have to be corrupted. I just got one very cheap with Curse Corruption and had Assassin's Spark in there, so it was fine for me. Void Battery for our power charge and our charge interaction. A Badge of the Brotherhood. Here I would say, if you want to try the Lightning Warp variation, you can use the increased cooldown recovery of travel skills per frenzy charge, would be better. If not, we don't really care about any of the rolls, but we do want to anoint Thiefscraft on here. Thiefscraft is a very cheap anoint, costing us only a clear, a brown, and an orange oil. And then we're going to use, this is normally a 30% int node, we're going to use a Tattoo of the Storm, giving us an additional power charge to again scale our power charges. And then we have a Heat Shiver. Now this Heat Shiver might not be cheap. This is one of the most expensive items on this build. I think combined with the Skin of the Lords and the Blood Notch, Immutable Force, as well as the Large Cluster, I think those are the only really expensive items. Rest should be fairly cheap. But don't take me on that. The market can change, especially after a video gets put out. So I think this build is about 30 to 40 divines, but it could be very wrong, it could be more. And of course in this value I'm ignoring the Mageblood. The Mageblood is something I had before, that's why I used it. If I wouldn't have had a Mageblood, I would have made this build work without Mageblood. So I don't add the Mageblood to my assumed build value. I maybe should, but I'm just saying it this way. I accept the Mageblood. I think I spent like 30-40 divines. Now, back to this. So the Heat Shiver with the +1 power charge is not really needed. We lose a bit of AoE not having it, but this really drops the cost of the build a lot. So I would say that first. And if you enjoy the build, if you don't mind the dying, then go for a Heat Shiver with power charge eventually. Then the rings just need stats. We can get life, cast speed, and mana cost on those. And then on one we want Frostbite. We don't care about the minion damage. We don't really care about the evasion rating or energy shield. Nice to have, but we really just care about Frostbite and stat on one, and then stats and life on the other one. And finally, we have a rare piece of gloves. The gloves, I either recommend you to go with just resistance gloves and then rolling the implicits, or you go with the temple mod, increased damage with hits against shield enemies plus resistances, and then go for the implicits. Very importantly again, you need cold damage leech as life here. We could replace widespread destruction with Doyani's lesson to get our life leech, but I prefer AoE on the cluster and the cold leech on the gloves. And then we have Unnerve for again getting a bit more single target out of our gloves. This is also why we don't have free spread here and instead get the free spread on our cluster again, so that we have the leech on the gloves. And yeah, that's pretty much the build. Now of course, build either a Mageblood or of course here, or of course you can use a life and resistances build, covering your stats, covering your resistances, getting a bit of life, getting a bit of armor, and you will be good to go. Now for your flasks, if you're on the Mageblood version, I prefer a diamond, silver, granite, jade, getting our survivability up a bit more. Suffixes will be elemental resistances, shock avoidance, so we don't need to get it on Tempest Shield or the Mastery, armor and evasion rating. And on the non-Mageblood version, we want a jade, diamond, and then a bismuth flask instead of the armor flask. And we're going to use a quicksilver flask instead of the silver flask, because the rot gut gets charges on crit and also gives us the onslaught with the frenzy, so we have almost a permanent onslaught on the map, as well as a really high amount of, not a high amount, but consistent amount of movement speed. And suffixes are evasion rating, movement speed, and crit chance. Now you can also get a crit flask and get the suffix resistances, which is totally fine either. This specific variant will use the flask to cap the resistances, so we can focus a bit more on our stats and damages on our rares. But of course you can also try to get more resistances on the rares, will increase the price of the rares of course. Now that has been pretty much everything. If I've forgotten anything, you have any questions or anything is unclear, as always feel free to ask, either down in the comment section, on Discord, either via DMs or on the designated channel on my server. All that being said, have a wonderful day and a lot of fun with the build, and I will be testing the next Legion farmer pretty soon.